Okay, so in this video, I'm going to help you with a couple questions out of the 5-6 homework. All right, so here's one, and it's a cotangent. Okay, so let's think about how that works. All right. So you ought to kind of have in your mind, tangent does this, kind of positive, and cotangent does that. You got vertical asymptotes and that kind of thing. So we're gonna think about that right off the bat. The fact that this is a positive 5, so it's going to be a stretch, but it's not going to do any kind of flipping across the x-axis. So you shouldn't have things that look like that. Okay, so that's out, and that's out. Those are both tangent. All right, so when you're working this one, you should see the 5, and that's the amplitude. So it's been stretched vertically. So every point is 5 times as far away from the x-axis. Then that x plus pi over 6, you can solve the inequality to do that. And you remember that cotangent is x over y. So when you think about those 5 key points, you can think about where cotangent is undefined. Okay, it's going to be undefined when your y-coordinate is 0. So it's going to be undefined here and here. So the typical asymptotes happen at 0 and at pi, okay? But we're going to have a bit of a shift, aren't we? Because when we subtract the pi over 6, we're going to be starting at negative pi over 6, and then we're going to do pi, take away pi over 6. So that's 6 pi over 6 minus 1 pi over 6. So the asymptotes are going to be at negative pi over 6 and 5 pi over 6. Okay, so I know it's between B and C, and both of them have the asymptotes that they need to have, don't they? Okay, so the asymptotes don't help us. Both of them are starting like they're supposed to at negative pi over 6. So it really has to do with that 5 and what you remember happens on cotangent. Okay, so remember how you have things being undefined at the beginning and the end. So you have vertical asymptotes there. Okay. And then what you should think about, see in this, typically with cotangent, it's just there, okay? So when you're up here and you do x over y, you see how that's going to be 0. So when you're halfway in between, you're going to be at 0, right? And then when you're here, okay, then that's going to be equal to a positive 1 normally, okay? And then when you go around to here, that's going to have a cotangent of negative 1, since these right here will be square root of 2 over 2 negative, and then positive square root of 2 over 2. Okay, so that's what normally happens. But now this had an amplitude of 5, which means this stays undefined, this becomes 5, this stays 0, this becomes negative 5, and that stays undefined. Okay, so what should happen is when I go and I look at the halfway point, that should be 0, which it is on both of them, so that doesn't help me. Then I need to see which one's been stretched, so that halfway between these two, which would be about right there, that I go all the way up to 5 and all the way down to negative 5. So it looks like this one, okay? This one looks like the regular cotangent that hasn't been stretched. When you're halfway in between, it looks like you're only at 1. So your answer should be C, okay? All right, now let me go to another one. Let's go to one that involves secant or cosecant. Let's check I think number 10 had a good one. Okay. Okay, so on 10, what I'm being asked to do, let me do 4, oops, let me snip it. Okay, this one is 4 secant x plus 5 pi over 4. All right, so really what I'm going to think about is cosine. And then I know where the secant should be. See how the cosine is graphed, and then they have the secant on top of that? Okay, so I know it's going to have a vertical stretch of 4. So my the graph in the middle, which should wind up being cosine, okay, should go all the way up to 4. So it's not this one. This one only goes to 1. This goes to 4. Okay, that one doesn't even go that high. Okay, so that one's out. Okay. This one goes all the way to 4. So I'm looking for ones that go all the way to 4. So it's either B or D. Okay, so that part I know because of the amplitude being 4. Now I'm going to take the x plus 5 pi over 4, and I know cosine's period is between 0 and 2 pi. So a full cycle happens there, and what it typically looks like is this, right? Starts at 1, goes to 0, goes to -1, back to 0, and back to 1. Okay, and so now that's going to happen, but it's going to happen from -5 pi over 4 to whatever 2 pi minus 5 pi over 4 is. So let me work that out. I need a 4 for the denominator. So it's 8 pi over 4 minus 5 pi over 4. So it's going to go and do a full cycle between -5 pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4. Okay, so I'm looking for this to happen. All right, now I think it's really hard to see what they're trying to label on here. Okay, so like this right here is actually what they're calling -5 pi over 4. To me, it's over too much. This is that spot right there. Okay, so that's -5 pi over 4 right there. And cosine is supposed to start right there at 4. Okay, so when I look at this one and I'm over here at that tick mark that they give me, I'm not up at 4, am I? So that guy's out, so I know it has to be B. So I have to start at 4, and then I'm going to go to 0, go down to -1, back to 0, and then back up to 4. So that would be what cosine will do in one cycle, and then it would just continue. And then your secant graph is found by just then flipping, okay, on the making those U's at each of those high and low points. Okay, so I wanted to kind of talk through how you would go and find your graph there. And you need to show me some work. I don't want to see you just picking something. What's your thought process? How did you narrow it down? Okay. All right, let's do one more. Let's look at a tangent graph. Let's look at number 11. So I'm going to go back to the homework. Let's go to 11. Okay. Okay, so on that one, I've got 3 for the period, for the amplitude, 3 out in front. Okay, so I know 3 is the amplitude. That just means it's been stretched. So every point is 3 times as far from the x-axis. Okay, and then you see the -1 at the end. It's a vertical shift, but it's going to be down since it's negative. So it's going to go down 1 unit from where I'm used to it being, okay? And then with tangent has asymptotes, the typical tangent has asymptotes at -pi over 2 and pi over 2, okay? And so you're going to take your x minus pi over 5, that would be between those two. And so you'll add pi over 5 to both sides, all 3 parts. I'm just going to write it here so we can calculate it. Okay, and so the reason you see all the 10s up there is because when you try to combine these, you need a common denominator of 10. So this would be 2 pi over 10. This would be minus 5 pi over 10. So on this side, I have -3 pi over 10. So you see that -3 pi over 10 that they're using there? Then over here, you need a common denominator. This would be 5 pi over 10. This would be 2 pi over 10. So 7 pi over 10. So that means I should have asymptotes at the -3 pi over 10 and the 7 pi over 10. Okay, those would be there and there. And that halfway in between those two, you should hit 0. So this should be undefined, undefined. Okay, and then usually with tangent looks like this. Okay, Hey there. So usually with tangent, you'd be down at -1, okay? And then over here, you'd be up at 1, okay? But since it had an amplitude of 3, this would be -3, this would be 0, this would be +3, okay? All right, so our tangent should look like this. So that means we can rule out A, and we can rule out C, because we're doing tangent. So that means it's going to be between B and D. And then we've just got to double check on the stretch and the shift. Okay, so normally halfway between the two asymptotes, you'd be right at 0. Okay, halfway between the two asymptotes, you'd be right at 0. But then you've got to drag that down 1 unit. Drag that down. This looks like it went up 1 unit. So if you dragged it down 1 unit, it would be right here. Okay, so the answer to this question should be B. Okay, so let me go ahead and show you on the regular graph. Okay, that if you go here to B, and we can check our answer, and we got it. Okay, so I wanted to just do a little bit of help on certain questions off of the homework for 5-6. So there you